Have you ever noticed how the smallest movements can feel like the loudest messages? No argument, no tension in words, just a shift. He turns his back to you, and suddenly, something inside you becomes alert. Psychology calls this nonverbal emotional signaling, when the body expresses what the mind avoids saying. Because here's the truth. It's not about how he sleeps. It's about what his nervous system is trying to regulate. What this really means is that his body is choosing distance in a moment that is naturally designed for closeness. Sleep is one of the most vulnerable states a human enters, and vulnerability reveals truth. The message underneath is not always rejection, but it is a shift in emotional availability. This often signals that something internally feels unresolved, uncomfortable, or simply unprocessed, and instead of addressing it consciously, the body moves away. Not dramatically, quietly, but your brain notices. Because your mind is wired to interpret proximity as safety and distance as potential threat. So when he turns away, your system doesn't just see movement. It asks a deeper question. Why am I not being chosen in this moment of closeness? And that question is where the emotional weight begins, because the act itself is small, but the meaning you assign to it is powerful. So the real observation is not the position of his body. It's the pattern behind it. Because when behavior repeats, it stops being random. It becomes communication. Have you ever felt like something changed, but no one talked about it? No clear conflict, no explanation, just a growing sense that something is off. And then you notice he consistently sleeps turned away. Not once, not occasionally, but often enough to feel intentional. Psychology calls this passive withdrawal, a behavior where someone reduces emotional engagement without direct confrontation. It's not loud, it's not aggressive, it's subtle, and that's what makes it powerful. What this really means is not that he wants distance from you as a person, but that he may be distancing himself from something he feels when he's with you. The message underneath is, I don't know how to engage with this, so I'll step back instead. Because facing emotions requires clarity, and clarity requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels risky when someone is internally overwhelmed or disconnected. So instead of expressing discomfort, the body creates space, quietly, repeatedly. This often signals the presence of unspoken tension, small things that were never resolved, conversations that never happened, emotions that were never processed. And over time, they accumulate, not as explosions, but as distance. That's why this behavior matters. Because avoidance is not the absence of feeling, it's the presence of something that hasn't been faced. So when he turns his back, what you're witnessing is not indifference. It's a strategy, a way of protecting himself from something he doesn't fully understand or know how to communicate. And the danger is not the moment. It's when that moment becomes a habit, because habits become dynamics. Have you ever noticed how people say, I'm fine, but their body tells a completely different story? That's because the body doesn't lie. Psychology calls this somatic expression when the body reveals emotional states that haven't been consciously processed, and sleep is where this becomes most visible, because when the mind is tired, it stops performing, and the body takes over. So when he turns away from you, especially without explanation, it's not random positioning. What this really means is that something inside him is seeking regulation, not connection. The message underneath is, I need distance to manage what I'm feeling, not necessarily because of you, but often because of what's happening internally. Stress, pressure, emotional confusion. And instead of articulating that, his body creates space. This often signals a disconnection between internal experience and external communication. In other words, he feels something he doesn't know how to say, so he shows it. But here's the deeper layer most people miss. When someone repeatedly uses physical distance to regulate emotions, they are training themselves to disconnect instead of express. And over time, that becomes their default, not just in sleep, but in the relationship. So the question is not just why is he turned away? The real question is, what emotions are being managed silently, instead of being shared openly? Because whatever isn't expressed will always find another way to appear. Have you ever felt physically close to someone, but emotionally far at the same time? That paradox is more common than people realize, and one of the clearest signs of it is how two people sleep. Psychology calls this asymmetrical comfort, when one person feels safe in proximity and the other unconsciously seeks distance. So when he turns away, it's not just about position. It's about where he feels most at ease. What this really means is that the emotional environment between you has shifted, even if no one has acknowledged it. Because comfort is not static. It evolves based on connection, trust, and emotional safety. The message underneath is, I feel more regulated this way than when I'm fully open, and that matters. Because when someone feels safer turned away than turned toward you, it reveals something deeper than habit. It reveals preference. This often signals that closeness in that moment feels demanding rather than natural. Not because you are demanding, but because something within the dynamic feels unresolved, heavy, or unclear. And instead of confronting that directly, the body chooses the path of least resistance, distance. But here's the insight that changes everything. People don't move away from what feels safe. They move away from what feels complicated. So, if turning away becomes consistent, it's no longer about sleep comfort. It's about emotional positioning. And emotional positioning always reflects something deeper than words. Have you ever heard the phrase, "it's nothing," and somehow felt it meant everything? That's because nothing is often a psychological shield. Psychology calls this minimization a defense mechanism where someone downplays what they feel to avoid confronting it. And behavior follows that pattern. So when he turns his back and acts like it's normal, casual, insignificant, what this really means is not that nothing is happening. It means something is being avoided. The message underneath is, I don't want to deal with this, so I'll make it seem small. Because acknowledging a shift requires responsibility, and responsibility requires emotional effort. So the mind chooses the easier route. Normalize the distance. Ignore the discomfort. Continue the pattern. This often signals emotional fatigue, not necessarily with you, but with something he hasn't resolved internally. And instead of processing it, he disconnects from the moment where closeness would expose it. But here's the deeper insight. When something is consistently dismissed as nothing, it usually holds the weight of something unspoken. Because humans don't create patterns around things that truly don't matter. They create patterns around what they are trying not to feel. So, the next time you sense that subtle distance, don't focus on the explanation. Focus on the repetition. Because repetition is where truth reveals itself. Have you ever wondered why someone can be close to you, but still feel the need to turn away? It's not contradiction, it's psychology. Psychology calls this emotional self-protection, when someone creates subtle barriers to avoid feeling exposed. Because closeness is not just physical. Closeness is emotional exposure, and exposure requires safety. What this really means is that in that moment, turning away feels safer than staying open. The message underneath is, I don't feel ready to be fully seen right now, not necessarily because of you, but because something inside him feels vulnerable, uncertain, or unsettled. And instead of risking that exposure, his body creates a boundary, distance. This often signals a gap between external connection and internal readiness. In other words, the relationship may exist, but the emotional availability fluctuates. And sleep becomes the space where that fluctuation is expressed most honestly. But here's the deeper layer. People don't avoid closeness because they don't care. They avoid it when closeness feels like pressure instead of peace. So if turning away becomes a pattern, it's not just about needing space. It's about redefining where safety is felt. And when safety is felt in distance instead of connection, that's where the real conversation begins. Have you ever noticed how something that once felt meaningful slowly becomes automatic? No decision, no awareness, just repetition. And one night he turns away, then the next, and the next, until it becomes normal. Psychology calls this behavioral habituation, when repeated actions lose conscious intention and become default patterns. But here's what most people misunderstand. Just because something becomes automatic doesn't mean it's meaningless. What this really means is that the relationship dynamic has shifted from conscious connection to unconscious routine. The message underneath is, we are no longer choosing closeness. We are just coexisting. This often signals a loss of micro-intentional behaviors. The small actions that maintain emotional intimacy, touch, orientation, presence, not because the relationship is broken, but because it's no longer being actively maintained. And the body reflects that. Because when intention disappears, connection follows. But here's the deeper insight. Distance that becomes routine stops being noticed by the person creating it, but not by the person receiving it. So, while it may feel normal to him, it feels like a slow emotional drift to you. And that's the danger, not the distance itself, but the unconsciousness behind it. Because what is not intentional is not protected. Have you ever tried to tell yourself he just needs space, but something inside you whispered, "This feels different"? That intuition matters, because not all distance is the same. Psychology distinguishes between healthy space and emotional disengagement. Healthy space is intentional, temporary, and respectful of connection. Disconnection is passive, repetitive, and emotionally unclear. What this really means is that the context defines the behavior. The message underneath is not just in the act of turning away, but in the pattern surrounding it. Does he reconnect later? Does he reach for you at other moments? Or does the distance persist beyond sleep? This often signals whether the behavior is regulation or withdrawal. Because space still maintains a bridge, disconnection removes it, and your nervous system can feel the difference. Not logically, but instinctively. But here's the deeper layer. When you start questioning whether it's just space, it's often because something in the connection feels inconsistent. And inconsistency creates uncertainty. And uncertainty creates emotional instability. So the real question is not, is he turned away? The real question is, does he return? Because in relationships, distance is not the problem. Lack of return is. Have you ever noticed how, in the absence of explanation, your mind starts creating its own? No words from him. No clear reason, just that repeated moment of him turning away. And suddenly your thoughts begin to spiral. Did I do something? Is he losing interest? Is something wrong with us? Psychology calls this cognitive gap filling, when the brain tries to resolve uncertainty by creating meaning where none was explicitly given. Because the human mind is not built to tolerate ambiguity, so it fills the silence. What this really means is that his lack of communication is activating your need for clarity. The message underneath is not just in his behavior, but in your reaction to it. Because when patterns are unclear, the brain defaults to self-referencing. You don't just observe the distance, you internalize it. This often signals a deeper dynamic. One person avoids expression, the other overanalyzes in search of it. And that creates imbalance, because while he regulates through distance, you regulate through understanding. But here's the deeper insight. The discomfort you feel is not weakness, it's awareness. Your mind is trying to make sense of a pattern that hasn't been explained. And that's where clarity becomes essential. Because when behavior is repeated without communication, interpretation becomes inevitable. And interpretation can either bring understanding or create distortion. Have you ever realized that it's not a single moment, but the pattern that tells the real story? One night means nothing. 2 nights might be coincidence, but repetition is intention, whether conscious or not. Psychology calls this behavioral consistency, the principle that repeated actions reflect underlying emotional states more accurately than words. So when he consistently turns away, it's no longer about sleep. It's about what is being expressed without language. What this really means is simple and uncomfortable. The relationship is communicating something, even if no one is saying it. The message underneath is not always, he doesn't care. But it is always this: something here is not fully aligned. An alignment is not built on assumptions. It's built on awareness. Because here's the truth most people avoid. You don't need to chase meaning. You need to observe patterns. Patterns don't lie. Patterns don't confuse. Patterns reveal. Final closing, awareness changes everything. This was never about how he sleeps. It was about what his behavior reflects and what your perception reveals. Because relationships are not defined by isolated actions. They are defined by repeated emotional signals. And the moment you stop ignoring patterns, you stop betraying your own awareness. You start seeing clearly. You start interpreting accurately. You start choosing consciously. And that changes everything. Because the most powerful position in any relationship is not control. It's clarity. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt something was off? Just from the way someone acted without words? Comment below with your experience. And if this opened your eyes to patterns you couldn't explain before, subscribe for more deep psychological breakdowns like this.